In the year 2008, something was discovered beneath the dry, silent soil of southern Mesopotamia. At first, it looked like a routine excavation. Broken walls, scattered clay fragments, and the remains of what was believed to be a minor Sumerian settlement. But beneath those layers, archaeologists uncovered something unexpected. A sealed underground chamber. The entrance showed no signs of collapse or erosion. The structure looked intentionally preserved, as if it had been hidden with purpose rather than lost to time. Inside the chamber, there were no human remains, no burial artifacts, and no signs of ritual activity. Instead, the walls were covered with inscriptions, and at the center of the chamber was a carefully arranged spiral formation of clay tablets. Hundreds of tablets were placed in a precise geometric pattern, leading toward a single central tablet positioned at the deepest point of the spiral. When the team entered the chamber, several instruments began to malfunction. Lights flickered, recording devices experienced interference, and electronic equipment failed without explanation. Some researchers later described the environment as if the chamber itself resisted observation. The tablets were identified as Sumerian in origin, written in cuneiform script. However, their content did not match known Sumerian texts. Traditional Sumerian writings usually focus on kings, myths, rituals, agriculture, and wars. These tablets were different. They contained structured numerical sequences, environmental patterns, and references to large-scale global changes. During translation, the first fragment revealed a disturbing statement. It described a future condition where the surface of the earth would become uninhabitable and certain groups of people would move below ground. At first, researchers assumed this was symbolic language related to death or spiritual beliefs. But as more tablets were translated, the meaning became more specific and consistent. Texts repeatedly described survival through descent into underground spaces rather than symbolic burial. One of the most shocking fragments described population distribution in a precise ratio. It stated that 9 parts out of 10 would move underground when surface conditions became unstable. This suggested a 90% relocation scenario, not as mythology, but as structured prediction. As more fragments were studied, a pattern began to emerge. The tablets were not random messages. They formed a coordinated system of information, including timelines, environmental shifts, and structural maps. One tablet contained what appeared to be a diagram of underground networks. These structures extended across large regions and included interconnected tunnels, chambers, and layered zones. The design suggested organized habitation systems rather than natural formations. Some diagrams indicated vertical connections between the surface and deep underground levels. Others showed systems that resembled ventilation, water flow, and energy distribution. The complexity of the designs raised questions about how such knowledge could exist in ancient Sumerian records. This led researchers to a critical question. If the Sumerians created these records, how could they have known about large-scale underground structures that match concepts seen in modern infrastructure planning? At this stage, theories began to split. One group believed the tablets were symbolic predictions based on environmental cycles. Another group suggested they might be recording knowledge inherited from an earlier unknown source. A particularly disturbing fragment introduced the idea of a triggering global event. The text described a condition where the sky would become unstable and surface conditions would rapidly deteriorate. Following this event, mass movement underground would begin. The description did not focus on destruction alone. It emphasized sequence and preparation, suggesting that the transition was structured rather than random. Repeated references were made to a phrase describing the surface losing stability and humanity descending beneath it. The consistency of this idea across multiple tablets suggested a unified message. As translation continued, another line appeared that intensified the mystery. It stated that memory of the underground was not new, implying that this process had occurred before or was already known. Shortly after these findings, access to the excavation site became restricted. External authorities took control of the area, and the original research team was reassigned. Official statements described the findings as misinterpretations of cultural artifacts, but internal restrictions suggested heightened concern over the material. Despite this, independent researchers began comparing the tablet descriptions with known underground structures around the world. Some of these structures were unusually deep, highly organized, and not fully documented in public records. In several cases, patterns resembling the Sumerian diagrams were observed. This raised further questions about whether the tablets were purely ancient mythology or something more structured. One final fragment discovered in the chamber contained a short and direct statement. It suggested that something described in the tablets was not a prediction of the future, but an acknowledgement of something already existing beneath the surface. After this discovery, all recording equipment from the chamber stopped functioning simultaneously, and no further data could be collected from the site. The excavation was officially closed, and the chamber was sealed again. The tablets were removed for analysis, but most of the research data was never publicly released. What remained was a collection of fragments that pointed toward a single consistent idea. A future transformation where the surface becomes uninhabitable, and a large portion of humanity moves underground for survival. Whether this was prediction, myth, or something else entirely remains unknown. In the months following the discovery, researchers attempted to reconstruct the full meaning of the Sumerian tablets. As more fragments were translated, a second layer of information began to emerge, far more structured and detailed than initially understood. What had first appeared to be scattered warnings about underground survival now revealed itself as a complete system description. The tablets were not only describing a future event, but also outlining the structure of an entire subterranean network. This network, according to the inscriptions, was divided into multiple layers beneath the Earth's surface. Each layer served a different function. The uppermost layer was described as a temporary refuge zone designed for rapid population relocation during surface instability. The second layer contained permanent habitation systems, including controlled environments for agriculture, water recycling, and energy distribution. The deepest layer was the most mysterious, referred to only as a restricted zone with no detailed explanation. The text repeatedly emphasized that access to deeper levels required authorization, suggesting a structured control system rather than an emergency shelter. This raised questions among researchers about whether the underground system was purely defensive or part of a larger, long-term design. Another section of the tablets introduced the concept of a global triggering event. This event was described in a sequence of environmental changes rather than a single disaster. The first stage involved atmospheric instability, followed by disruptions in natural cycles, and finally a rapid breakdown of surface conditions. Only after this sequence would large-scale descent underground begin. One fragment described this transition as unavoidable once certain environmental thresholds were reached. The wording suggested inevitability rather than possibility, implying that the system was designed with a predetermined response plan. As the translations continued, researchers noted repeated references to energy systems that did not match known ancient technology. The tablets described a form of light without flame and heat without sun, which some interpreted as references to advanced energy sources or unknown natural processes. These descriptions were accompanied by diagrams showing centralized energy nodes connected through vast underground networks. The complexity of these systems suggested coordinated engineering rather than primitive understanding. Another disturbing detail appeared in multiple fragments. The underground system was not only designed for survival, but also for population regulation. Certain sections of the text described limits on population distribution, movement control, and monitored habitation zones. This introduced the possibility that the underground system was structured for long-term management rather than temporary refuge. As these interpretations developed, attention shifted to whether the system was created by the Sumerians themselves or documented from an earlier unknown source. Some researchers argued that the technological descriptions were far beyond what was possible in ancient Mesopotamia, suggesting that the tablets may have been recording inherited knowledge from a pre-existing civilization or external influence. At the same time, comparisons were made with modern underground infrastructure projects and classified facilities. In several regions, large-scale subterranean complexes exist that are not fully disclosed to the public. While no direct connection could be confirmed, similarities in structural design raised further questions. The most repeated phrase in the tablets continued to appear across different fragments. It described a condition where the surface world would lose stability and humanity would move beneath it in large numbers. The consistency of this message suggested that it was the central theme of the entire collection. As tensions grew among researchers and external authorities, access to additional excavation data became increasingly restricted. Official explanations continued to describe the findings as misinterpretations of symbolic religious texts, but internal documentation indicated heightened sensitivity surrounding the material. Independent researchers who attempted to continue analysis reported difficulties accessing related archaeological sites and archives. Some data sets were removed or reclassified without public explanation. Despite this, a few remaining fragments provided one final insight. They suggested that the underground system was not merely a response to a future disaster, but part of a cycle that had occurred before. The wording implied repetition rather than singular prediction, hinting that similar transitions may have happened in earlier periods of human history. The implications of this idea were profound. If true, it would mean that the surface civilization is not permanent, but part of a repeating pattern of collapse and relocation. The mystery deepens rather than resolves. The tablets no longer appear as isolated artifacts, but as pieces of a larger system describing survival, control, and possible cycles of global transformation. The final unanswered question remains whether this system is purely theoretical, ancient memory, or a warning about a future that has already been prepared for in advance. After the increasing restrictions on research access and the classification of key excavation data, the remaining fragments of the Sumerian tablets were studied in isolation. Despite limited information, the final section of translations revealed the most alarming and speculative portion of the entire discovery. This section did not focus on structure or systems, but on sequence and timing. It described a progression of global conditions leading to a forced transition of human civilization beneath the surface of the Earth. Text referred to cycles of environmental instability that repeat over long periods of time. According to the translation, these cycles specific phase where surface conditions reach a point of irreversible change. Once this threshold is reached, the surface is no longer considered suitable for large-scale human habitation. At this stage, the tablets describe a coordinated descent into underground zones previously prepared for survival. The scale of this movement is repeatedly emphasized as affecting the majority of the population, with the figure of 90% appearing consistently across multiple fragments. The texts do not describe this transition as chaotic. Instead, it is presented as structured and phased. Initial movement begins in designated regions, followed by expansion into global relocation networks. These networks are described as interconnected subterranean systems designed to support long-term habitation. One fragment introduces the concept of surface abandonment. It suggests that once certain environmental conditions are met, human presence on the surface will diminish rapidly. The wording implies that the surface is not permanently lost, but temporarily unsuitable, requiring long-term withdrawal. Another section of the tablets describes communication systems that operate between underground regions. These systems are presented as essential for coordination, resource distribution, and population management. The implication is that underground civilization is not isolated, but interconnected on a planetary scale. As translation progressed, attention turned to the repeated references to prior cycles. The tablets suggest that this process of surface instability and underground migration has occurred before. However, no direct explanation is provided for how or when these earlier cycles took place. Innovation. This introduced a controversial interpretation among researchers. Some suggested that the tablets may not be predicting the future, but documenting a recurring pattern of civilization resets. Others argued that the language was metaphoric, representing cultural memory rather than literal events. Despite these debates, the consistency of the descriptions across multiple fragments made it difficult to dismiss the material entirely. The structure, repetition, and technical details suggested a level of intentional design in the narrative. One of the final fragments discovered contains a statement that has become central to all interpretations of the tablets. With it, it states that the underground systems were not created as a response to a single event, but as preparation for a condition that was already known. This implies foresight rather than reaction, suggesting that the system exists independently of any specific disaster and is part of a larger long-term framework. As the excavation site was eventually sealed and research access was permanently restricted, the remaining data became fragmented and difficult to verify. Official records classify the findings as inconclusive, while independent researchers continue to debate their meaning. With no additional verified translations have been released publicly since the closure of the project. What remains is a set of incomplete inscriptions describing a world where surface civilization is temporary, underground systems are structured and vast, and large-scale human migration may be an expected rather than exceptional event. Whether this represents ancient prediction, symbolic mythology, or something more unknown remains unresolved. The final line preserved from the tablets reads as follows: "Those who descend will remember. Those who remain above will forget."